All right, here we go. All right, we are back for episode, I believe this is like 12, maybe 13. I probably should go back and count. Of the Minnesota Due Process Coach. And I'm really excited. See, there it is. I'm really excited today to be joined by two of my favorite people who have already been on the podcast. And I've had some really great feedback from both of their episodes and lots of questions that have come from both, which has been really cool. Um, to do a director's panel today. I'm sad Carol Potter couldn't join us, but she's busy doing director things, truly, which is kind of the nature of this job for everyone, I would assume, right? It's always busy running in and out of different places, getting the things done. It's the end of the school year. People are trying to hire, people are trying to get programming ready, all the things. So I really appreciate both Dave and Mandy's time today. I'm not going to make them do any crazy intros or talk about
Thank you.
themselves.
I think I already heard you say that Carol's busy working while Mandy and I are not. So thanks for that.
Yeah,
Right.
putting
So,
us in a really good light today.
right.
You know, now I have to laugh about that. I'm like, dang it, can't go
Yeah,
back. There's no edits here. I always tell people, I'm like, there's no edits. This is live action. This is this is what you get. But
it's okay. We'll roll with it.
We
you've
will.
been busy
Yeah.
all day. Let's just
Yeah.
say that. I was hard enough to get you both here, and
Two
now
of the three of us scheduled is, I would say that's really good
that
percentage.
I would agree. That is very good. So we are going to answer some questions that were submitted to me or questions that have just been asked since Dave and Mandy's podcast, and also a variety of the different podcasts that we've had, and just seeing their perspectives on those questions, and what their thoughts are around the questions that have been submitted. So are you guys ready?
Yeah.
As ready
Well,
as we'll ever be.
we'll find out as we joked about beforehand, like, but we're both running on fumes. So if you get too in the weeds on some of this stuff, we're out. So
But we'll be honest if we need to take out.
that's right.
This is where I struggle, right? Is the weeds. You both know this about me. I like to like just keep digging. I was saying that to a psych today. I was like, if you need me to find something, I will. I will find it. I'll get real in the weeds. All right, so let's get started. So the first question that I had is when you think about higher placement, Fed setting 3 or 4. Do you want your teams to gradually increase, or is there sometimes incidents where you go from a 1 to a 3 and it's warranted, or a 2 to a 4, which I think is a really good question because I feel like I hear that a lot of jumping from a 1 to a 3, or we've seen a lot in our past practice too, from an initial to a 3. Um, and what your thoughts are around that.
Well, I have to tell you, whenever I hear some version of that question, Christine, I almost always go to someone's looking for someone for me to bless their ability to
Yeah,
do exactly what you're asking. Like,
totally.
tell me how we can make this happen,
There's
right?
a
How do
kid
we?
behind that
There
number,
Yeah,
is.
right?
Tell me,
Yep.
tell me the right answer.
and usually it's paired with some version of this is the toughest kid we've had in this building in a really long time, which is like their fourth toughest kid in like the last 3 weeks. So I guess I do have a little bit of skepticism behind like the motivations behind this rather than going back to least restrictive environment and really attempting how you might do something different for that student in their current educational setting to
Yeah.
make it more successful for that student. And I think that we think that these interventions are going to be even when they're tried are going to happen like overnight when it comes to an overnight change in a radical way rather than a progressive change that will happen over time. So especially when we're dealing with behaviors, if you're getting like a lot of aggressive behaviors or a lot of aggressive behavior language, like you're not going to just have an all of a sudden like abrupt change to those two categories overnight. So like what you're hoping for is that you're starting to see a gradual reduction of that. So you've got to give it time, which means you've got to like do things with fidelity and have the patience to see it through. So
Mhm.
that's my quick answer. And hopefully you're collecting data and you're being intentional and you're not just throwing mud against the wall and to see what sticks, but you're actually laying out a plan and following that plan. But I'll let Mandy comment on that too.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna give my standard gray response is that it depends on the kid, right? And so like I don't think you can make universal rules for something like this without looking at needs, without looking at the data, without looking at the current programming. You know, sometimes it's even as simple as looking at their environment. You walk into a setting and you're like, oh, well, this makes me anxious in here. So I can't even imagine a kid who's not regulated in this environment, right? And so sometimes those tweaks need to happen in other spots. I tend to not jump settings because part of our job is to rule out everything before we get to the next setting. And sometimes it's just level setting with teams to say, we're in a long game. I know it's super hard. How can you take care of yourself? How can you take care of your team? And what can I do to help support that? And sometimes that can help people get the right mindset that this isn't going to be, we're just going to do this for 6 weeks and they're going to get into setting four. We're going to do this for 6 weeks and they're getting into setting two. And so, really thinking about what that looks like and being clear as a director, what is it that I want to see from the team data wise to help make the next decision?
I think you just hit on something really important, Mandy, and that is how do you care for your people along the way? Because it is no doubt a tough situation, whatever the situation is. Like I'm not discounting that. So like how do we help those adults work through some of that? But
Right.
also
Mm-hmm.
like one of some of my passion behind don't rush this is also from the parent perspective of
Right.
like when they're hearing moving a student from 1 to 3 or 2 to 4 like too fast, they're just hearing a lack of ownership or you're just giving up on my kid. You might
Mm-hmm.
not be, but again, there's a lot of emotions involved, and I think if I was a parent, that would be some of what I'm hearing if that's progressed too fast.
Right.
Yeah. And I would tell people that are listening, if they're feeling stressed or overwhelmed, reach out and ask for help too, and be really clear with what help that you need. And maybe we can grant it and maybe we can't. But sometimes I think in my director role, like we're too far removed sometimes, and we just need to know what's really the sticking point with this. Is it just like lunchtime and everything falls off the rail? Okay, let me come in and observe that so we can work towards a solution.
Mhm.
Yeah. I like that you said that not to quantify because I feel like everybody's always looking for that number. Like how many weeks do I have to take data? How
Mhm.
many weeks do I have to wait before we talk
Yep.
talk about it again? I feel like I hear that a lot. It's funny, somebody actually texted me this morning. I have a student and I we want to move them and how many weeks of data do I need? And I was like, that's really an open-ended question because I have no idea who the student is.
Mhm.
I
I
I
don't know
will
what
tell
to
you
write.
this is my first year or 10th month working as an administrator in Pet Setting 4. Um, I don't hear that stuff anymore. And because not only do the adults here know that there's no other place for students to go,
Mhm.
but they know what they've signed up for with that. So there's that doesn't mean that it's any less hard. It's super hard on a lot of days. But there is a mentality shift to what you were just talking about. When you set some bar somewhere and say, how many more weeks, like just
Mhm.
listen to the tone there. How many more weeks do we have to do this before?
Mhm.
Rather than just saying, hey, this is our student, this is what we have to do. If we have to keep adjusting the plan, we'll keep adjusting the plan and keep coming back together as a team. But there's a mentality shift involved with that is really hard to do, and me included sometimes in things that are hard. So I don't know. There's it's a challenging topic.
It is. It is.
It's a
And even
hard.
getting support from, I mean, I remember when I was running around to all the buildings and supporting my gen ed counterparts, right? So you have principals that are like also in the thick of it with these students, right? And struggling. And so sometimes it's even just making sure you're supporting at that level so that they can have the right language with the rest of the team. And that's hard because they're like, this is so disruptive to my day, to this, to that. And so that can be a hard component that you're balancing and that our teachers are balancing. My sped director saying one thing and my building principal saying another thing.
Hmm.
Mhm.
No, for sure. I think that kind of leads into another question that I got that we kind of briefed about before we hopped on, which is what are your thoughts around what are some things that you've maybe thought about or provided for those kids that are sitting on the wait list or any strategies you can think of to give to staff out there, right? Because I think there is a a large amount of students sitting on wait lists to get into Fed Setting 4 at this point, and that's just the reality of it. I talked about that in my podcast with about mental health, right? Our mental health is on the rise. We're seeing a rise in those Fed Setting 3 referrals, all of the things, 3, 4, excuse me. What are some suggestions? And then also leading into those thoughts around suspension for those students that are either A, sitting on the wait list and are experiencing a lot of behaviors, or those students that are in Fed Setting 3 that are experiencing high levels of behaviors, and how do we handle those? Very philosophical questions for both of you, because I think it always lands on how you feel as an administrator towards suspension. I was saying that before we hopped on here with Mandy and Dave, is I came from working with both of them where we really were reducing suspensions in the charter schools that we were working in and really getting that number down. So I think it comes down to how you feel as an
Mhm.
administrator.
Well, and the law is super clear on K through 3. There is no wiggle room, and people want to pretend like there's wiggle room, and there's absolutely no wiggle room on that. And so I think that would be the first thing that I would say is you cannot suspend kids in K through 3. And the law is clear, and MDE has withheld every complaint that every parent has ever had on that. And so I think that is just a consideration for all of our teams that when kids are having a bad day, we can't use that strategy in those grades. And really in any grade, we should be really thinking about why we would be removing them from their educational experiences. So I'll just start with that. I feel like there was like 4 questions and one,
No.
Christine, with that. Um, I I mean, this was a long time ago, but I will share just like a little story of something that I was able to do as an administrator. And it's not possible everywhere, right? But we had some really tough kids that actually we had room and program to move to, but parents were like, nope, 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 this is not happening. And we had to get really, really creative with our space in the building and with our staff in the building. And so we rearranged some things. It meant that some teachers had a little bit higher caseload so that we could kind of make like a mini makeshift program
Mhm.
before we could get them while we were waiting for parents. We were going through advanced dispute resolution essentially while we were waiting through that process so that our kids could be safe, our staff could be safe, and we could kind of figure it out. And we never got it perfect. And eventually they did move to their setting, but I think sometimes it's just about like rearranging what you already have to make work. And our team was like, I will take the extra kids and I will teach an extra session of reading because it means that my room isn't getting destroyed and these kids are being taken care of somewhere else. So sometimes it's really about looking at all the resources you have within a spot to try to mitigate that explosion or those big behaviors. So I mean, I don't know how super helpful that is, but thinking outside of the box, thinking creatively, focusing like what is our biggest need? Sometimes I think we try to do too much, right? And the only goal for some kids is just some consistent regulation. So really being intentional about what our triggers are and supporting those social emotional needs because we know that's usually what is
Mhm.
at play with our kids who are really escalated. Dave, you probably have a lot more than I do.
No, actually, you just listed some really good options, and I think that it's pretty common, and I'm not endorsing this, but I think it's pretty common that districts will maybe go to a home-based option,
Mhm.
not to be confused with homebound. That's a different thing entirely.
Mhm.
Or they might go to a shortened day. I'm just going to caution. It doesn't mean that those things aren't appropriate sometimes, but in maybe in rare cases. But you really have to balance that with your obligation to provide FAPE to that student as a district. And in a lot of cases, if you're doing one of those two things, you might not be, or you might be flirting with not providing
Mhm.
FAPE. So you have to be careful there. It really depends on what that home-based service or that ultra day looks like and how you've set that up. And your ability to implement the IEP as it's written right now and to deliver those services. So I realize districts are in a weird spot there, but I think that the things that Mandy listed at the beginning are better options for a district to look at when it comes to like looking at your existing resources, maybe, or maybe you're able to bring on some exist or like an additional teacher for a period of time to help um, with the load at the school that you're talking about, so that maybe some of the duties can be shifted to that additional help. There's just different ways around that.
And I will say we've had being a director at a secondary online school, like we get a lot of people who are enrolling with us, whether it's been a suggestion from a guidance counselor, like, hey, I know you're waiting for this placement, and it could be placements for treatment. It could be, other placements too, and are, suggest some options like that. So I would say any of our larger districts that have online settings, it's a really great way for students to get some of their academic needs met in a different environment because sometimes all you need is that just environmental shift to help kids regulate.
Yeah. I like that you said that too, Mandy, that they might be on the wait list for other things outside of federal setting for as well. I think we have to remember that there are care and treatment, those facilities, or at least getting them into some sort of treatment facility is something that is real as well for these students. All right. We'll get into something lighter.
Yeah, these were heavy hitters off the top,
I
Christine.
know they are. But and maybe you're seeing this and maybe you're not, but I feel like these are the questions that are continuing to keep coming up constantly because in the districts I work in, the referrals for setting four are so high. And I don't know what is behind that, right? There's so many
Well,
variables, but
I think though too, we have to think about the landscape of what the percentage of students that are in special ed right now and where some of those pressure points are too. Because I think about when I started in Hastings in around 2014, um, I believe our percentage of students on IEPs was right around 11, 12% at the time.
Mhm.
Somewhere around 2017 or 18, it was jumping up into that 13,
yeah,
14%. Now it's pretty common that 13, 14% is kind of the norm for some districts, but some districts are in that 17, 18, even 20% zone.
yeah.
And so when you think about the increase of kids on IEPs and also then what you talked about earlier in the conversation about like having students, and it does happen quite often, almost fast track to Fed Setting 3 programs. Now those Fed Setting 3 programs are getting really full. So we're either building additional Fed Setting 3 programs when they may or may not be needed,
Mhm.
Yep.
or and then we're looking for ways to maybe offload some of those other students to Fed Setting 4 to make room in the Fed Setting 3s because everything's backlogging. So it all comes back to what we said earlier in the conversation about like, are we actually looking at the programming options in a least restrictive environment way and looking at ways that we can better equip our teachers and our
Mhm.
paraprofessionals to address the needs that are coming through so that we're not having to like shift all of these needs into more clustered or center-based programming options.
Right.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a systems piece as well. I
Mhm.
think about this year at Blue Sky, we've been doing a ton of work around intervention, MTSS, and we've really been focusing on tier one. And that can be a really great place for teams to focus, right? Is when you have really good supports at that tier one level, it helps all kids. And so as you're kind of mimicking that model, the same could be said for special education setting one, two, and three. And so when I hear things like that, I think with my systems brain about what needs to be restructured, what
Mhm.
do staff need to be successful in their settings, like training. Sometimes it's just materials, like they even have things to be able to teach these kids that are walking in through their door. And then I think allocating groups and times and schedules so that they have a prep time. They have time to write their due process. And so that's always been super important to me as a director, is to give teachers the time to do the parts of their job. And that can be hard because we're working on limited resources, but we know when we take care of that group, they'll perform better for
Yeah.
students.
And that's an important piece too, Mandy, because the workforce shortage is a real thing,
Mhm.
which
Mhm.
continues to compound the issue here. So
Absolutely.
as child count continues to go up and we are putting more demands on the system to address the child count issues, we're
Mhm.
also trying to figure out how do we not burn out staff
Mhm.
that are hard to find to begin with and we're trying to retain. So
Yeah.
the climate and the culture makes a huge difference in a district when it comes to keeping those people feeling like they want to stay to do this work with us because it's very hard work. And so it's definitely an all-in problem when it
Mhm.
comes to all of our parts.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's
Like,
a really good way to think about it. And I am glad you brought that up too, Mandy. And we talked about it when Dave and I were on the podcast last of what a good leader does for people, right? And
Mhm.
that's really important with programs and these kids that are sitting on wait lists and that are really challenging and hard is, and how do you support those teachers and make them feel, I don't want to say good, but like supported and that they want to come to work every day and do
Mhm.
the hard things. It really does come down to your leadership style
Right.
and how you choose to lead your staff. So I think that was a really good way to think about it. I didn't think about that before till you brought it up, so I like that. That leads into our next question, actually, about curriculum. So I'm glad you said that, Mandy. Good lead way. Look
My
at you.
favorite.
Ah, so good. When you think about curriculum for your programs, what are some things that you are looking for? Do they need to be special education specific, or how do you like to help choose programs for your team? So basically, how do you find that curriculum that I feel like you just talked about that we need to really make our teachers successful? What are some things that you look for and when you're making those decisions?
It's like my number one thing. I'm going first, Dave. I'm sorry. You
I know,
know, I
Mandy,
love this.
if people are just listening and not watching the YouTube right now, they wouldn't see your face light up the way that I just did. I know.
Oh, this is like my thing. Every time I am hired first to go into a school as a director, it's like, yes, this is my love language, and I feel very, very strongly. So I will be on my soapbox for 15 seconds, but then I will answer the question is that hands down, there is no way that we can expect our teachers to be successful if we do not give them evidence-based, research-based materials to be able to do their job, right? And so that's just like hands down my thing. And so I feel very strongly about making sure that teachers have the strategies and the instructional materials that they need in order to be successful with kids. And so I have a pretty thorough process when I go in. I started at Blue Sky 3 years ago, and they were doing all one-on-ones with students. And I just cannot imagine how incredibly time-consuming that was to service every goal in that capacity. And so one of the reasons why they were doing it is because they didn't have instructional materials to be able to do it. And so we really talked about this. I work with my teams of teachers to pick supplies and materials and strategies and trainings that fit because I know I might think it's the best thing and I would want to teach out of it, but at the end of the day, I'm not the one teaching out of it. So I have to make sure that it works for them. And sometimes we choose right and sometimes we choose wrong and then we go back to the drawing board. But I do have a list of questions. So if anybody wants to look at kind of what I have used in the past, they can certainly reach out to me and I'll share it with them. But really looking at, is it evidence-based? Is there a body of research around it? I do look for special ed specific things because I think there is a unique need that our students have for that, and I want to make sure that they have the materials. I will also often look at what general education is using, and if there is an intervention curriculum that's attached to that, I will review that as a part of my process too, just to say, would this work for a tiered setting? The other piece that we do a lot of too, especially at secondary, is strategies. And so it's important that we're teaching students strategies and that we as instructors understand and know the strategies that we're using. And so I encourage teams to also continue their own training, their own supports. Um, the other soapbox that I'll briefly go on is that if you buy something for your teachers to use, please, please, please make sure you have an implementation plan and a professional development plan. I can't even tell you, they're not going to use it if it just sits on a shelf and they don't have the support to actually implement it into your classroom. So I'll pause because I could talk about this all day. Dave, add on, and then I'm sure we'll
No,
have something more to
I,
add on.
I love hearing Pastor Mandy go to town on this topic. This is great. So this is good stuff. I know I agree with everything. I think that we have
Did
to
everybody hear that? Dave just said he agrees with everything that I said.
everything. Yeah,
We have
great.
that recorded.
You do. But I think we do have to ask ourselves along the way, are we just needing the curriculum, yeah, or the resources for the replay, like, excuse me, for the augmented skills, which you talked
Mhm.
about, they're related to the disability they're lacking, because you don't want to be removing the student from the access to the general ed
Yeah.
curriculum unless you have to, because a replacement type of curriculum or a replacement class should be more rare. Like, and so hopefully we're not having to do that very often with students, but we also need to be prepared for the fact that we might have to do that with some students. But we should have a plan for like differentiating between the two of those too when it comes to a path that a student might be on in a particular area. The other thing that I will just comment on is that you want your curriculum to be aligned from a vertical and a horizontal standpoint. So if you're working in a larger district,
Yep.
you don't want one elementary school using one thing for something and another elementary school saying, well, I don't like that. I want to use something else. If a student's going to be transferring, which sometimes happens with interdistrict transfers or something else from one elementary to another, it shouldn't feel like they're having to learn something completely different with a different teacher as they work their way into a new building. And the same thing is true as a kid levels up to middle school or high school. Like, do we know where we're going with that student? So I was surprised last year when Carol and I did a little polling, and I appreciated the teachers' honesties at different levels when we asked them, do you know like what maybe OTs or speech or what another teacher, like a resource teacher, does at the middle school level from elementary? And the answer was no.
Mhm.
And the same thing from middle school to high school. So I think it's just surprising sometimes how much we're maybe unaware of like where we're going with the student. We're only thinking of like what's right in front of us. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind with curriculum.
Yeah. I would totally add that even in a small district, you should do vertical alignment. I think that's just hands down, you need vertical alignment all the way through. And part of it is to know how your kids are leveling up, and that will link to IEP goals. But the other piece is also from a very practical standpoint of materials, is it's not like there is hundreds of thousands of special education curriculum in use. And so
No.
not even is it just using something different, Dave, it's sometimes like they already did this. So like we got to think of something different for them to do. And so and then people get very territorial of what they're using. And so to have a nice vertical alignment means that everybody has what they need
Yeah.
in a space that's developmentally appropriate for our kids as they level up.
Manny, should we take a bet as to whether or not Christine almost got interrupted by
Oh, she
one of her kids, or was it her husband that just almost broke it? Because did you see her face change?
Yes, I did. It
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
absolutely her son, is my guess.
It was both my son and my husband. My husband literally was
Oh.
standing on the stairs. We're gonna call him out right now. And he's like, I think Christine's on her podcast right now. And that's when I looked at him and I was like,
Yeah,
sure am.
that was great. Now everybody is going to tune in to the
Yeah.
actual YouTube because
Yeah.
Correct. Just to see the panic on my face.
yeah.
Right.
Because I'm like, nobody talk. I just love like hearing both of you talk about the curriculum piece of it because I feel like we always talk about, and I don't want to say it's negative, but the behavior side or the like we were talking about before, fed setting and like suspension and all of I don't want
Mhm.
to say the icky, but it is kind of sometimes the negative parts of being a director. It's nice to like talk about those pieces that are really exciting, right? Like the things that we get to provide for students to help them achieve and to help them get back, to that level that we want them to succeed at. And I think that's just really cool. So thank you both for sharing that.
Christine, that's our number one job. Our
Right.
number one job is to identify the gaps and skills and teach to it. That's like our only job, right? And so, but we get sucked into all the other things. And so it's good just to come back to that and remind us of that. I was also going to add one more thing because I can't stop, but I would also say if you are in a district or in a space that allows you special education teachers to sit on curriculum committees or be part of curriculum redesigns. I'm very, very, very thankful. I have a supportive team where I'm at now, where it's kind of like a mandate. One of my special education teachers will be on any rewrite of any gen ed curriculum. And so we can really make sure materials in gen ed are accessible to our students and we can work on modifications right within that curriculum writing process. So I would just put a plug for that because that's helpful for everybody.
No, I think that's great. Well, we only really have time for one more question. I knew this is how it's going to be. I knew it. I was like, because we could do
You better ask a good one at the end.
questions for days. Oh, I don't know. I guess I'll give you guys the choice. So I have a question around EL and special education, or I have a question around evaluations and waiving, versus obviously not waiving. Dave's face is like, I do not want to do that one. Um,
I do want to do that one. So,
We it's I'll let Mandy choose. I'm good with either one.
well, I bet if we're really fast, we could do both. So I will say for the evaluation waiving one is look into your district process. Um, I know Dave and I have talked about this before. Most schools have some sort of flow chart for how to make those decisions.
Yep.
So just make sure your teams are using that. The other piece is that you really have to look at the needs of the kids. So really look at what data do I already have? What data do I need to support continued qualification and continued instruction? What's helpful to me as a case manager in my job? And then go through that flow chart. So I think if you're kind of looking at it with those two lenses, it's a really great place to be. And don't do it alone. Do it with your eval team. There should be other people weighing in on that to help you make that decision as well.
Yeah, we made a really nice flow chart in my last district, and I will say, like, it did point out the times that, like, may be appropriate for a team to consider when waiving an eval, with the parents' permission, of course, is appropriate. But like Mandy just said, like, what I'm not talking about when I say that is, like, at the secondary level, and we're talking about maybe a 10th or 11th grade kid, you don't have to do like the fifth or sixth
Yeah.
IQ test or Woodcock Johnson again, like for a re-eval. And so those are the types of reasonable things within an actual eval that you're still doing, where you go, we've got enough information on Woodcock Johnson and IQ that we don't need that again. But what do you need when it comes to the information for what the student's going to need for programming and skill development and all the rest? And do you have the right things in that eval plan to not shortcut it, but keep it as short as possible, but also get the information you need for programming purposes. So
Right.
that's the big thing there. I hate seeing long eval reports at the
Mhm.
second level when they're not
Mhm.
necessary, because it is paperwork that you don't need to be doing.
Yeah,
So just gather what you need.
exactly.
I think that's great. I also heard you both say too, which I say to everyone, is systems. Having the right systems in place, right? Like your district should have those systems, a flow chart or some sort of system that you're using to make those decisions so that they're cohesive across the district. Uh,
Well, and this was something we were talking about briefly before, like, we got started with the recording, and that is, like, related to that. You should have standard operating procedures or guidelines or whatever you're going to call it in your district that people can come back to so then when they can't reach Mandy or Dave because we're not super reachable all the time, like,
mhm.
they can come back to a warehouse of information to say, hey, how are we going to handle, like, EL or EL issues or ESY issues or whatever in terms of qualification, because within the law there are also, like, gray areas in terms of, like, how a district's going to decide to handle certain topics, and that's up to your director ultimately to set the tone for those things. And so your director will hopefully provide some guidance along with the leadership team, however that's defined, and hopefully you have some guidance to fall back on.
Right.
Absolutely.
I think that was a good point too, Dave, though, that really having those in place as well so that you aren't always having to ask Dave and Mandy or having to go back to your director. And it really starts to build that autonomy within, I think, your coordinators and your
Yep.
supervisors, and quite honestly, in your teachers as well, that they feel empowered to make those decisions because you've given them the framework to make those decisions. Um,
Yeah, it's comforting for them, frankly, and because it shouldn't be as person dependent on
Mhm.
as what it often is. Doesn't mean that you won't have times that the situation is super unique and you might need to get, the advice of that director or supervisor or coordinator. But
Right.
hopefully the general idea of whatever it is you're looking into is captured in a practice somewhere.
yeah,
Exactly. And if you don't know, if you're listening to this, you're like, I don't think this exists, it might, and it's just warehoused somewhere inconvenient, right? And so I would encourage people that are listening to ask, because sometimes we spend time creating guidance documents and we like it when people look at them.
we do. I make a lot of guidance documents and I really hope people look at them.
Exactly.
Always like, did you look at my document I made? It's really nice.
We had some good people really nerding out on this, and they're very proud of it.
Exactly.
For
Let them have their moment.
I
That's
know.
right.
I like that. Okay, so the last question is around EL, and it's just with EL services and special education, right? How do you filter what out? What is the biggest impact? And I think this it is a short and a long answer, right? Of how do you, or what would you suggest, I guess, where you'd be your first steps?
I guess one of the things I would wonder right off the bat is for the people that are going to evaluate a student for like special ed evaluation for a student that happens to be EL. This is where your teammates have got to be really real with you to say, do they really know where the English language issue ends and where a disability maybe begins? And I say maybe because we don't know if there's a disability involved. And if your folks aren't feeling that they are competent in that area, and I don't mean that as a disparaging comment because I don't know that like a lot of people without training would feel like they know how to really dive into that topic. Like that's where we might need some training. Let's
Mhm.
and it's okay because like special ed is a really vast
Mhm.
pool of things that we have to dive into. It's hard to be an expert in all the areas, especially if EL is not super commonplace wherever you work. So I think you've got to get some training in.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with that. And I say this all the time about evals, about IEPs, is to use the expertise of your team, right? So make sure you have a psych there. Chances are they have some experience in that or know another psych that they can call, right? And so, or and have the EL teacher there too. I mean, they're working with these students, they have an expertise in that, and then have your special ed teacher available. So I think you can use that team approach to look at kids specific data to be able to guide your next steps. And I that is not unique to EL, but I would say that about any need area.
I would agree. Team decision.
Hmm.
I keep preaching that to people. It's a team decision, just like deciding whether you want to waive an eval. It's a
Hmm.
team decision. Did we all talk about this together?
I will say I see and the people silo off the work even after a student might qualify and they might be they might be receiving EL services and IEP services. I see the left hand, the right hand often not talking to one
Yep.
another. It's a pretty common thing. So it just like anything else, you've got to stay in touch and overlap with each other appropriately for the services that you're doing. They're not as siloed off as what I think we often treat them.
Agree.
Very much. Look at that. That was great. All right. Well, we did it. That's exciting. I mean, there's still some questions, but we could keep going, I think, for hours, but it is Friday and we're not going to go for hours. But I 100% appreciate both of your time and your expertise and your opinions always. And I think Dave said it best, really defer back to your director in your district for what they feel is best or what their philosophical beliefs are around something. And it's always good. We've talked about this before to have a phone a friend or have somebody to talk to about it to get a second opinion. But ultimately, it is your district and your director's decision what the final say is. I think we all need to be clear with that. um,
It's similar to what I've heard special ed lawyers say sometimes. Mandy and I are directors, but we're not your directors. So listen to your director. Go back
Yeah.
to that
Yeah.
person. Yeah.
I like
Yeah.
it. I
And
like
we
it.
Yeah.
don't want your directors to send us angry emails
Yeah.
saying, "What are you saying?"
And find you,
Agreed.
right? Well, I
Yeah.
appreciate both of you for being on the podcast again. It's so fun to always connect with the people that I enjoy talking to in a different way, right? It's fun to all get together and kind of talk about the things that we really enjoy or those topics that we really like Mandy with curriculum.
Sorry, I had a geek out moment there, so thank you for humoring me.
You're all right. I like to do it all the time. I do it over like due process law, and I think people are like, Christine, that's so weird. I'm like, it is very strange, but I really enjoy it. Dave, what
You
is your
sound
topic? I've never asked you quickly. What is Dave's topic that he geeks out over?
I used to be more of a due process wonk, and so I definitely do like that stuff. And I still do. I will say, and I admitted this to you before we got started, like the last two roles I've been in, I'm a little bit further removed from the granular talks about due process guidance than what I have been in the past. So I kind of miss it, but I do get kind of fired up about it because I think it is a topic that I am passionate about because it's where our instruction should begin when it comes to like gathering our game plan for how we're going to work with that
Yeah.
kid. And also, sorry, you got me started here. You
I
asked.
know.
And also for the folks too that wonder like why do we care so much about this? It's also it's a legal protection for students and for families and also for the district. Like
Hmm.
for limited
I feel like I
resources
should go
we
like this.
oh yeah. For limited resources that we have at the district, all it takes is like one thing to go sideways for some of those resources to be drained, and then we have
Hmm.
fewer resources for the students that need it. So it is a firewall for a lot of different reasons. So I get kind of worked up about it. So there you go. There's your answer.
I
I
like
like
it. Good. We all have something. I like it.
it.
All right. Well, this episode will drop on YouTube, Spotify. Where am I now? Apple Podcasts. You can catch it on any of those. Please like, follow, share. I did tell one of my husband's coworkers that I would give him a shout out today because he listens to me in the office, which I love because
A
they do.
non-sped person is listening to you in the office?
I know they're, heavy road construction listening to me in the office, which I think is hilarious,
That's amazing.
right? But
Does he know there's music on Spotify too? Because
I
he
know,
could
right?
listen to that. Yeah.
I would think he would find it, but he is my hype man. His name is Tulsa, so thank you, Tulsa, for always listening to the podcast in the office and supporting the Minnesota 2 process coach, even though maybe you don't know what we're always talking about, but that's okay. We appreciate the support. And so if you have any questions or any comments you want to share for Mandy or Dave, you can drop them below the video on YouTube, or always send them to me via email or LinkedIn, whatever you choose. But thanks for joining us today.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.